The topic for today is intuitive perception in Acem meditation. Let's not forget the other title underneath, how to sell newspapers to strangers on the phone. Now, intuition. It's something we've all probably experienced, but it still can be a bit hard to pinpoint exactly what it is. I found this quote I want to share with you about intuition, and it goes like this. Intuition is when you have a keen sense of feely feels that feel feely, and you feel like you know things that you don't know, but you do know because you're feeling them. Even though it's a joke, I still think it tells us something about intuition and the fact that it is hard to pinpoint. But on a more serious note, we have the webpage Psychology Today, and they define intuition as a form of knowledge that appears in consciousness without obvious deliberation. Now, you might say, okay, that's good, but what does this have to do with selling newspapers to strangers? And maybe you're the other way around and you're like, I love that newspaper thing, but what is this shady intuition thing? And I will try to explain. Now, maybe you haven't thought about it, but when we are meditating, we are involved in an intuitive process, both using and developing our intuition as we go along. Now, I will return to this later, but I will also tell you a little bit about my background, because I used to be a telemarketer. And if you don't know telemarketers, they are those sometimes annoying people who call you up on the phone and often being overly positive, just like this guy. So I will try to draw some parallels between my experience as a telemarketer, my experience from Acem meditation, and see how this also can say something about the intuitive perception. And along the way, I will provide some perspectives on how we can open up for more of our spontaneous activity in meditation. So I hope this sounds good to you. And if you could please give me a little sign if you think this sounds interesting. You can push that little emoji that shows your hand is up, or you can just raise your hand. So, oh, that's great. Here the hands are pouring in. That warms my heart. Now, what I just did now was a little manipulation. It's a technique I learned from my days as a salesman. As a telemarketer, you are encouraged to get the customer to agree with you on smaller things, so that in the end, they will agree when you ask for something bigger, when you ask for the sale. It's called a yes ladder. Now, please forgive me, I will not manipulate you anymore today. But to my defense, I don't have any newspapers to sell you today either, so I think you'll be fine. However, 12 years ago, I did. This is me selling newspapers to strangers on the phone. I worked for Aftenposten, a big newspaper in Norway. And when we called up our customers, we all used the same script. And I still remember it today. It went something like this. Hello, this is from Jonas from Aftenposten calling. I have some really good news for you. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Now, even though we all said the same words, there were some sellers who sold significantly more than others. And some sellers didn't sell anything. And so we all understood that it wasn't the words themselves that mattered, but it was the way they were said. It was the non-verbal communication. For me personally, I discovered that when I had a friendly tone like this, hi, it's Jonas Meyer calling from Aftenposten. I have some really good news for you today. That didn't work well at all. People would just hang up on me. I think I seemed a little suspicious, but if I changed to a more strict tone, hi, it's Jonas Meyer calling. I'm calling from Aftenposten. I have some really good news for you today. Then people would be more intrigued and I would do a lot better. So of course, it was a fine balance. It could be too much and people would react negatively. But I noticed how my mood would affect the sales. If I was sad, disappointed, or maybe didn't believe the customer would buy, it was as if the customer intuitively felt how I felt and reacted to that instead of the words I was saying, the fantastic news I was going to give them. And if you've been to Acem communication course, you probably experienced this. The words we say are only part of what we communicate. In a group such as this, you'll get feedback on the content of your words, but also how you sit in the chair, your eye contact, your tone of voice, and everything else that might affect the group and also says something about you, your story, and your character. So this concept of nonverbal communication has turned into this popular saying you might have heard before. The words we use are only 7% of communication, and the rest is nonverbal. Now, this is actually not true, at least not entirely. It's based on research done by Albert Mehrabian from the 70s, but his conclusions have been exaggerated and taken out of context. What his research does imply is that if we are faced with two contradictory messages, we will pay more attention to the non-verbal message. This is probably because the non-verbal cues reveal the intention of the sender and it tells us something about the emotion. And this could explain the days I had a hard time selling newspapers because the two channels were not aligned. You can reflect on this yourself when you are trying to influence someone. Are you congruent with your nonverbal communication and the words you are actually saying? And there was one study done on salespeople, and it showed that only one training session would be enough. And if the people who attained that training session then use their body language to reinforce their verbal message, they would increase their sales numbers by up to 50% or even more. There have also been done some interesting research on the nonverbal communication of teachers. First of all, it's very clear that the nonverbal communication of teachers makes a huge difference to their students' academic progress. But it's not only how the teacher communicates, but it's also how the teacher is able to pick up on the nonverbal communication of the students. And picking up on these nonverbal cues, like you're sensing the mood, you're picking up on some small things, and then you can adjust your own communication. And doing that, it's not a conscious, deliberate process. It's more spontaneous. And it's a result of being present and somewhat sensitive. So we are, among other things, using our intuition. So nonverbal communication and intuition has a strong connection. So to illustrate this, I would like to show you a study. It's done by the psychologist Nalin Ambadi. And she wanted to find out how long will it take for a student to make an accurate evaluation of a teacher. So she found that students who had been going to class the whole semester, they would make fairly similar evaluations to students who had only seen a small sample of a video clip of the same teacher. So now I would like to invite you to make a guess. How long would that video clip have to be for the students to make a fairly accurate evaluation of this teacher and similar to those who had followed the whole semester? So please, if you can use the chat and make a little guess. What's your guess for what would be the correct answer? How long would that video clip have to be? So there's pouring in guesses here. Oh, interesting. Okay. I think, oh, this goes too fast, but there's a lot of great guesses. Now, the correct answer, as you can see, is 2 seconds. I think 5 seconds was the closest guess. 2 seconds, that's all they needed to make similar evaluation and an accurate evaluation of the teacher. And not only that, but the video clips were without sound. It worked better if the video clips were without sound. Maybe that's because then they didn't have to deal with these two contradictory messages, as I talked about earlier. Now, this is a typical intuitive evaluation happening very rapidly and without recourse to conscious thinking. Now, that's not to say that intuition and speed always is linked. In Acem meditation, we would say that intuitive knowledge is something that can emerge over time. And perhaps you were participating in the last Acem webinar where Elisabeth Heimdal talked about creativity and how an idea goes through a nurturing phase before it blossoms. And intuitive insight in meditation is similar. Perceiving in an intuitive manner might not be having flashes of intuitive insights, but it could be involved having a notion that grows over time. Though in modern psychology, it has become popular by many to view intuition as a sort of supercomputer, capable of processing lots of data, information, much faster than the regular thought processes. And it's therefore a quite useful tool when making decisions. A proponent of this is Daniel Kahneman, who you might have heard of. And in his famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he refers to intuition as the fast type 1 thinking. He also warns against the dangers of relying too much on this fast way of thinking, because we might have an accurate intuition, but it can get clouded by our emotions and our prejudice. There are also some other ways of looking at intuition. For example, this more spiritual take. In this understanding, intuition lets us access a sphere our regular senses do not have access to. This understanding can be traced back to the Greek philosopher Plato. You'll find it in the Romantics in the 19th century, and you'll find variations of this in every world religion. So this is a contrast to the biological understanding of intuition in modern psychology. If you go to Amazon.com, you'll find books about intuition like this, typically in the New Age genre. So there's many ways to understand intuition, and it could be described as either a result of experience and a totality of the other senses, or as a sort of hidden sense of its own. It could be a biological or a spiritual phenomenon, and it's sometimes described in relation to its speed. But what is similar to them all is the idea that intuitive knowledge is something that appears in consciousness without using our rational will. So I'd like to show you one last quote about intuition from a person who was both a psychologist, but also had his feet well planted into the metaphysical world, into mysticism. I'm talking about Carl Gustav Jung. And he wrote extensively about intuition, but I chose this little quote. We can understand thinking, feeling, and sensation, but intuition is another thing. We do not know how we arrive at an intuition. It is perception by way of the unconscious. So this might be a good way for us to understand intuitive perception in Acem meditation. As when we meditate, we daily invite parts of our unconscious to play themselves out through our spontaneous activity. And over time, letting parts of it become more conscious. I want to show you a representation of this. So this blue circle, it represents our awareness. And here we have the meditation sound represented by this loudspeaker emoji. Now we are repeating the sound in our mind, as you know. We are thinking the sound with as little effort as possible, and at the same time allowing our mind to wander freely. Now I'll add some objects in our awareness, and these will be symbolical representations of whatever things can appear in our spontaneous activity. For example, we could have, this could be body impulses. We could have attitudes or moods, emotions. Here, this could be visual scenery. And then we have, as we often have, our thoughts. We keep a relaxed focus on the sound without disturbing whatever impulses, moods, thoughts, and so on happening at the same time. And by doing this, we are bridging the gap between the conscious and the unconscious. Now, it's important to note that we cannot choose our own spontaneous activity. It is a result of letting our unconscious set the agenda. Now, in Acem meditation, you could say intuitive perception is linked to what is happening in the periphery of our awareness. So if you take a look at the model, we will add a periphery here. It's in the outskirts of our awareness. And here we are allowing phenomena to play themselves out, that if we were to try to focus directly on them, they would disappear. So now maybe you can see that it has appeared a purple star in the periphery of the awareness. And you could try if you can see the purple star and see if you can just look directly at it. If you do that, it will disappear. Now it will go back to the unconscious. The only thing we can do is focus on the sound with a light focus, with a free mental attitude. We keep on meditating, and perhaps the purple star will appear again. You can try again if you can see it. Can you see the purple star? If you try, it will go away. No, it's not because you're stupid. Actually, it's because of my presentation, of course, the PowerPoint presentation. But the point I'm trying to get across is we can't look directly into our unconscious, but we are using the sound and our awareness to invite it in. And our task is not to register, catch, or even be aware of these processes happening. We just let it happen. Now, let's take a different look at this representation. If you remember, I earlier talked about telemarketing and how the words we used are only a small part of what's happening in the communication. In the same way, we could say that our thoughts in meditation are only a small part of the spontaneous activity. Even though we know this intellectually, many of us are longing for what we call deep thoughts in meditation. We want to have existential thoughts, profound thoughts, or some kind of importance to our thoughts. So then we feel that we're getting somewhere and that our meditation has some kind of value. And when we have so-called everyday thoughts, we can get frustrated. And in this sense, I think we have a tendency to give our thoughts a lot of attention, and we treat it as a king of the spontaneous activity. So I'll give it this little crown, the king of the spontaneous activity. I think this is because our thoughts are the easiest parts of our spontaneous activity to put into words. It's closest to our language. So when the king is just regular, not particularly interesting, just boring, we can get frustrated. Now, we can't say that our thoughts are only 7% of our spontaneous activity. We have no way of measuring that, but we could say that our thoughts are only one of many kings and queens in our spontaneous activity. So we'll give a crown to the body impulses and the moods, and everyone gets a crown. The visual scenery, even the purple star will get a little cute crown. So let's take a closer look at such a everyday thought. For example, this one: I have to remember to buy new tiles for the bathroom. If you don't know, tiles are those ceramic pieces of clay that you use to cover up floors and and uh, and walls. Now maybe you remember this guy, the telemarketer. Let's call him Simon, and let's pretend he's an Acem meditator. And he has just moved in with his girlfriend, and they have a joint renovation project of their bathroom. So he's sitting in meditation, and to his frustration, he's thinking about the tiles again. I have to remember to buy new tiles. Now, beneath the content of the thought, there might be some worry. There lurks a deeper concern in him about how living together with his girlfriend will turn out. And maybe he's a little bit sad that his girlfriend isn't showing more enthusiasm for their joint renovation project. And he could even be frustrated by his girlfriend, as he feels that he's doing all the work. Now, this frustration and this sadness and this worry, it might not show up, or he might not notice it in his meditation, but it's still there, part of his spontaneous, as part of his spontaneous activity, but it could be very subtle. Or it could maybe surface in disguise, perhaps as boredom. So he's sitting there thinking about the tiles in meditation, and he grows restless, and he's thinking, why do I always have to think about these boring everyday thoughts? So his everyday thought will be accompanied by other elements in his spontaneous activity, such as this. And we can imagine other people, many, having the exact same thought on the content level, but it will manifest in different ways in each of the meditator's spontaneous activity. The content of the thought will be accompanied by a number of different emotions, impulses, and so on, that most profoundly will say something very significant about the meditator's existential situation. Now, we could call this an existential signature of the meditator, in the sense that it is unique to each meditator, and it will be unique in each moment in time. So this is why focusing so much on the thought, or rather the content of the thought, is in some way superficial, or at very least limiting. So when we are sitting in our meditation and we're frustrated with the everyday boring thoughts, we're not acknowledging the depth and the different variables that are actually there. We're looking for depth on the level of content, on the verbal level, and not seeing the non-verbal parts. Now, one important note here is that this frustration happens spontaneously, and thus it should be allowed to be there in meditation as everything else. But it could be a sign that there are parts of ourselves we don't have much access to yet. There are parts of our spontaneous activity that we are blocking out. And a sure sign of this is usually restlessness. So this is actually a great thing about restlessness in meditation, is that it points to something in ourselves that we have yet to recognize. So there's a potential. So then, what should we do when we are restless and having these everyday thoughts? So using what we have learned about intuition, I actually have a solution for you. It is pretty good solution if I have to say it myself. So you should pay close attention now, and this might change your life. So what you should do is ba, 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 ba. Repeat the sound with a free mental attitude. I know you probably heard this before, and this sentence can be frustrating in its simplicity, but it's also very profound. Now, I will make two distinctions based on our discourse on intuitive perception. So what is characteristic of the intuitive perception is an opening towards what's actually there. So there's an openness and there's also a sensitivity. Now, a telemarketer cannot disregard the verbal or the non-verbal communication of the customer. If they do, their ability to connect would be diminished. And as meditators, we cannot disregard our own spontaneous activity. We cannot force the repetition of the sound. We are working towards an effortless repetition of the sound that is also sensitive somehow to the spontaneous activity. And this is not about trying to be very aware of our underlying existential situation or trying to figure out our existential signature, or am I blocking out something now? It's not about that. It's not about trying to be intuitive or produce purple stars in the periphery. Nothing like that. It's an openness that entails us to not trying to change our spontaneous activity. We are open towards what is, no matter what our preferences are. So we might not always like our spontaneous activity, for example, the everyday thoughts, but we're not trying to change it. And we also remain open towards our repetition of the sound, because it's by working with the sound that we can cultivate a higher degree of inner freedom. So both producing the sound, but also sensing the sound in our inner ear requires a certain sensitivity. And if we are taking the sound for granted, then we're perhaps not really listening. This mechanical repetition of the sound will often lack sensitivity, because the sound is never just the sound. It is also changing from moment to moment under the influence of our spontaneous activity. So the way we are sensing the sound is also a source for relating to more parts of ourselves. So to conclude, when we meditate, we may have something to learn from the telemarketers. The telemarketer will influence a customer by using the entire repertoire of both verbal and nonverbal communication. And in the same way, by working with the meditation sound in meditation, by being open, being sensitive, over time we can become more aware of how our spontaneous activity actually is challenging us. Not only the thoughts, but also the emotions, moods, impulses, attitudes, and so on. And we can become aware of how it affects our repetition of the sound and perhaps how it makes us concentrate. So when thinking and listening to the sound in an open, sensitive manner, we are approaching what we could call an intuitive perception that over time lets parts of our unconscious become at least more conscious to us. And this also involves opening up to the unfinished and the fragmented inside of us. And by letting it be there as part of the spontaneous activity, we are integrating these unfinished fragments and facilitating a psychological processing. Now, this can sometimes be painful. It's not necessarily a strong, intense pain, but it could be very subtle and low key. But in the long run, it can give us an opportunity to achieve a greater inner freedom that will also impact our life outside of meditation. And When opening up like this, we also allow peace, calmness, and the more quiet parts of ourselves to appear in our consciousness. And these are parts of ourselves, we cannot command them into existence, just like the purple star. It has to be invited in through the use of our meditation sound and an open, sensitive attitude towards the sound and towards ourselves. So, in contrast to the telemarketer who is trying to influence his customer, we don't have a goal when we are meditating. We we're not trying to reach a certain result, but remain open towards the process, even when it takes us places we maybe didn't imagine or maybe even wouldn't have preferred before when we first started. So that was my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.